Oh, lovely. I've just noticed that Neil said something about when the functional syllabus was first introduced. We had a functional syllabus in the 1970s with Judy Garton Springer with the Strategies series. She brought it in, and then they introduced this sort of notional idea, notions to do with time or measurement or so on. So you had the structural syllabus where we were teaching grammar structures, and then people said, hey, you know, but we use language for communication in real situations. What can we call that? So function. Functional exponent would be an example of the language. So could I have a packet of cigarettes, please? Is a functional exponent. It's an example of a polite request. Yeah. And obviously there are lots of different polite requests. There's not only one. Yeah. So that's just one exponent for polite requests, or different exponents for apology, like I'm terribly sorry is one. Please accept my apologies is another exponent. I'm sorry is another exponent. So lots of different ways of saying the same thing. Or Nada's saying that Michael Halliday also sort of like talked about exponents as well. Yeah, so all these sort of like gurus of methodology have all sort of introduced different ideas on teaching function and how to communicate properly. One of the questions that I was thinking about was, you know, sort of like, when you're teaching function, do you actually teach, is there a difference between teaching function at lower levels and teaching function at higher levels? What do you reckon, Yasmin?
Yeah, I think that certainly there is a difference. I probably people are going to put it in the chat as well. The language, the complexity of the language itself can be different. Sometimes even the topic, the function itself might be the same. So it might be, I don't know, for example, making suggestions, which is a function in an A2 level and maybe in B2 level as well. But the language that we choose to teach would be different. Like, for example, you might say, how about going out? What about this and that? Basic, you know, sentences, basic forms. While in higher levels, I would say with B2, C1, you might use more complex sentences like, I'd check there if I were you, which is quite a more complicated form, or take my advice using chunks of language with, you know, more complex form, or if you'd ask me, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's a little bit of playing with the language itself, with form, even though the function itself could be the same. What do you think, Mari?
So, I mean, what you're saying is we play safe, don't we? We teach sort of neutral, safe functions at lower levels, and maybe just one or two that they use. Yeah. Whereas at higher levels, we've got like a broader range of language, and we might go down to sort of like really slang and really formal.
Yeah, exactly, like expanding the language, the form, while it's the same function, the same topic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I was also thinking that maybe at higher levels you're dealing with more kind of sensitive subjects, like, you know, expressing sympathy, for example.
Yeah. So you mean like the topics could either, like the function or the context, better word to say, the context can change based on level. You mean like, so simpler context, lower levels, what sympathy, or I don't know, how to respond to a complaint letter, or generally
exactly at higher levels.
Yeah.
Whereas at lower levels, it's basic survival language, polite requests, expressing obligation, expressing ability, talking about future plans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Asking about future plans, or maybe giving simple opinions, or I think.
Yeah.
For example, I agree and I disagree. Whereas at higher levels, you're going to go into sort of like more subtle areas, partially agreeing, like half agreeing, but you don't want to upset the person.
It goes more into details as well, doesn't it? Like when you say partially agree, these are details of the language. Yes, I agree, absolutely.
So at lower levels, we're going to keep it simple and safe, and at higher levels, we can expand and look at the kind of subtle nuances of the language as well, with the pronunciation, intonation, facial expressions, how to disagree politely.
Yes, absolutely. The intonation and the pronunciation, even the body language, the paralinguistic features, they all will help, play towards that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing was, we were thinking about, what is it about function that makes it difficult to teach, and sometimes teachers want to avoid it?
I think I quite like this part, which I have to steal this from Thornbury, the very famous Thornbury. I think something that teachers should, and even I think if teachers can make it clear to students as well, but particularly teachers, they shouldn't be looking for a one-to-one match between form and function. So again, this is from Thornbury, but so for example, you say, I don't know, thank you for sending me the flowers. And then you say, thank you for not smoking. And the form is the same, thank you, plus verb plus ing, blah, blah, blah. The form is the same, while the first one is just expressing thanks, and the second one is expressing prohibition. So different functions, the same form. But then we will have something, I don't know, like let's say, thank you for not smoking, no smoking. The form is totally different, but the function is still the same. So I think the key is for teachers and students not to be so structured and, in a closed form, structured way of things, because, I understand that maybe it is difficult for students who have intolerant learning and they're intolerant to ambiguity learning style. It is going to be tough for them to accept that. But as Mari said in the video, context and keeping the context and the topic throughout the lesson is the key. So not letting the students drag the topic or the context and make it like a form or a language or grammar lesson is quite dangerous, isn't it, Mari? It can happen.
It certainly is. And something happened this morning that made me think, actually. One of the students arrived at the school, and you could say, come in, asking them to come into the school. But I said, in you come. So, it's the same exponent, but the word order is completely different, and it could be very, very confusing for the student.
Yes, exactly.
And that thing, when you go ding dong, oh, that'll be the door. Now, I could be saying, there's someone at the door. Could you open the door, please? Or I could be saying, oh, the building firm have just delivered that door I want, and it's just arrived.
Yes, exactly. The new door that I ordered. Absolutely, yes.
That'll be the door. So, I mean, it's very tricky. So what is it the person's actually saying? And like you said, context is so important for that.
And I think with both teachers and students, they just need to get their head around, like, look, this is not going to be a grammar lesson. There's not going to be one particular form for it. There are going to be many of maybe forms or different, structures, but the context will stay the same. The function will stay the same.
And the other thing I was thinking about was, the distance. We were talking about the power relationship between people. So, when we're working together, I say, oh, yes, I'm not in tomorrow. you know, I'll see you the day after tomorrow. And you say, okay, fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're talking to a boss, because your boss is kind of up here and you're down here, you go to your boss, it's kind of, excuse me, you know, may I have a word? Are you busy? You know, and then I was wondering if it might be possible for me to have tomorrow off. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I'm wondering now,
Yes.
but I'm using the past tense because I'm saying, you know, I respect you. I'm, you know, making this big space, power differential between us.
Yeah,
I was
exactly.
wondering if I might, the tentative bit as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Different way of saying it. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
So, you know, it's being aware of those subtle nuances in your relationships with people to ensure that the exchange, the conversation that you have goes smoothly.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
One of my students said, hello, darling, to me, and I had to go, ooh, excuse me, you know.
Yeah, not knowing where
No, that's too familiar.
Yeah. I have a similar story, Mari. My husband, who's also an EFL teacher and teaches English for law, so that's ESP course, and he also has, so he teaches B2 level students where they are basically graduating. They're law students. They have to pass an English module, so teaching English, basically teaching English for law, and they have to pass that course to graduate. So their level of English is quite high. It's B2, C1, or even sometimes higher. Now, because they have the language, sometimes they don't know, again, the same thing that Mari just gave us an example, they don't know where to use. So every now and then he comes to me and says, this student has emailed me, started the email with, hey, doc, and they mean dear doctor or hi professor, hi teacher, something like that. But because they have that language and they have heard, like, instead of hi, hello, dear, blah, blah, they can say hey, but maybe not in an email to your university teacher. They would say, hey, doc. And that's quite like, it's like, and then my husband, Paul, he's like, why did they say that? I have to email them back and say, this is not polite. You need to start the email, blah, blah, blah. And he finds himself actually teaching them that usage, or is maybe appropriacy, the function, whatever it is, via email. But it's the same thing, Mari, with the darling that you just mentioned. It's the same thing.
It's also a cultural thing, isn't it? Because sometimes with the students, there's a breakdown in communication because of cultural aspects.
True, yeah.
So I get students calling me Miss Mari or my teacher. Yeah. Because in their context, that's how you address your teacher. Yeah. And trying to break that habit, because it's kind of, it's so deeply entrenched. They feel like they are, you know, they can't say Mari. That's far too familiar. They wouldn't be allowed to do that in their own culture. So if they stick Miss on the front, maybe that'll make it all right, soften it a bit. Yeah. Or we're not even going to go there, but we'll say my teacher. Yes. And that will be respectful. Yeah. So trying to break that habit.
Yeah, talking about cultures it's very often, I think, with us when teaching function lessons. I think most of us do this, and we find ourselves, because English culture, obviously, like any other culture, English culture is different from other cultures. And I think we find ourselves trying to teach the culture first and make them aware of it, and then teach them the language. And I think it's kind of, you know, for example, like, I don't know, functions like asking for requests, ordering food. We've got so many function lessons on these topics that in some cultures, like, you know, maybe Middle Eastern cultures, maybe even Spanish, Italian culture, maybe Turkish, Greek, the sentences, they start with a verb, like with imperatives, while in English, we have to form a question form. And very often, when I'm teaching those functions, I find myself, I'm reminding my students that, okay, you don't say it like that. In English, you have to ask the question and not start it with the verb. And we have this chat of cultural awareness, if you like, with students. And then we get into the actual language and teaching the form before, you know, moving on to anything else.
Somebody was saying on the chat, you know, how can we get examples of this real language? And I think, you know, watching films, TV, soap operas, those sort of things, you can actually, you know, acquire some of this real language that people use. But there's nothing like living in the culture and experiencing it firsthand to be able to, you know, learn how you interact in different situations.
Yeah, being in the like that English speaking environment is obviously, nothing beats that. But as you said, films, soaps, everything like that will definitely help. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I had homestay students for a few years, and I always remember one of my French homestay students saying, I'm not going to say please, you know, we don't say please, I'm not going to say please. I said, that's fine, you know, don't say please. If you want to sound rude, that's entirely up to you, you know. And then given a few days, she said, please. And I said, way, success.
Brilliant, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably down to her living with you or being in that context so much that she probably after a few weeks digested the fact why she needs to say please, there is something missing. And when she feels that need, then she started using it. It's about digesting the culture, it's about digesting the context before being able to use that form or the actual function.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we think about tips you give? I mean, my tip is always context, whatever.
But probably, Mari, you're absolutely right. Probably the most important thing is just sticking to the context and making sure context is your priority. Absolutely. And not being dragged or obsessed with form so much, not and making that clear to students as well, because very often they look for it as well. They look for form, they look for some rule and this and that, but context is the key. How about practice?
Also, I'm just thinking, also exaggerating, you know, over exaggerating how you say what you say. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Because often the students will say, oh, that's fantastic. And she's saying, it doesn't sound to me like you think it's very good, you know. So can we have, you know, the gesture, can we have the expression, oh, that's fantastic, you know. And hopefully if you exaggerate, you're going to get them sort of like, you know, modulating it a bit and actually sounding interested.
Exactly. Yeah. And another tip for function lessons, Maria, what do you think about practice? The practice is probably the most important part of it, like, you know, creating that scenario in different ways so that they can get as much practice as possible, or giving them the scenarios probably with lower levels, more prompts, more, you know, indication of what the scenario is, and for higher levels, probably just the topic or letting them to use their imagination.
And then there's a devil's advocate aspect as well of scenarios, isn't it? I mean, there's a lovely one in a book called Act English by Peter Watkin Jones. It's an ancient book, but it's such fun. And it's a boy and his girlfriend. They've gone to a restaurant for a meal, right? Her role play card says, you know, you're in the restaurant, you're going to have a good time, and you want to order champagne and the most expensive dish on the menu. Yeah. And the boy's role play card is, you're really short of cash. You've only got, you know, this amount of money. So you need to try to persuade your partner to, you know, be a little bit economic in what she chooses on the menu. And it's such a nice role play. And they, you know, the students have such a laugh with it. And then you have your other students, you know, as waiters with the tea towels over their arm and the menus, you know, sort of like, are you ready to order now? And so on. And this whole dynamic of the guy saying, oh, I don't think we need to have champagne tonight. You know, it'd be really nice just to have a nice bottle, you know, a nice carafe of water. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's actually very nice. You have to go for it. Like you just gave this perfect example, Mari. And I think the key is, obviously there are lots of course books and there are, you know, prompts and scenarios in the course books as well. But I think the key is for you to, like, generally, like, we sit down before teaching a function lesson, think about the scenarios, and you will have had them in your daily life. It's just a matter of sitting down, thinking of your past experiences.
You need to have that communication gap, though, don't you, for it to work?
Absolutely, yes, communication gap, and or information gap activities, so that they kind of, it creates that. Absolutely.
Neil's just said that Peter Watkin Jones is actually a waiter now in his wife's restaurant. Would you believe that? And Gabby was saying she has a student who's always saying, what? What? Yeah. So how do you break this habit? You know, so what's so rude, isn't it? What? You know, sorry, I didn't catch what you said. You know, could you repeat that? Yeah. Trying to get them to say something more polite than what?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So maybe practice. So going back to tips, sticking to context. Yeah.
So tips. So context important. Exaggerating how you say it to get the students to repeat it with a bit more kind of intonation and so on. Although a word of warning, if you're teaching Japanese businessmen, don't exaggerate it, because they end up sort of sounding like Japanese housewives. So their intonation's too high.
Right.
Very, very good mimics.
Yeah.
And communication gap to make the interaction fun. So it's, you know, there's unexpected little frissons in the interaction, so to make it more fun, and also make sure that they don't have this, you know, they can't read each other's role cards. And not too much information on the roll cards, because, you know, sometimes if you put too much information on the roll card, it becomes very controlled rather than free, and you want to be nice and free and fun.
Yeah.
And what I really like to do is have a box of props, you know, hat, mustache, glasses, various things. So when you do the role play, they can also dress up, and you can arrange the classroom the way you want, and it makes it more fun as well.
Absolutely. That makes it more fun and makes it more experiential, which is fantastic. And lots and lots of learners, they learn better when it's experiential, putting them deeply in context, making them experience the
absolutely
that natural, you know, environment is crucial, and they will not forget that. Yeah,
I agree.
Right, I think, Mari, we are kind of on time for, like, I think to maybe look at questions. I'm not sure, Mari, what do you think?
I think it's about time for some questions. I noticed Gabby asked a question, you know, where can people find functions? You know, how do you know what functions you can teach? To be honest, there are not a lot of new course books out with function. Would you say that's true, Yasmin?
Yeah, that's right. But
there was a Leo Jones, wasn't there? Leo Jones Functions in English. Whether it's still in print or not, I don't know, but that was a very good book for functions. A lot of course books have, you know, as you were saying, Hedy, they have a section called Social English. And sometimes they have, you know, little videos, like English File has little videos and Social English sections in it where you can do a little bit of work on functions.
Yeah, they call it different things. They call it like social English, as you said, real life. But if you look closely, most course books or decent course books, you would see a part of each unit is specified to that real life function lessons. They have those. But you can also think about functions yourself as well.
Your own ones. And Gabby says that there's Functions in English by OUP John Blundell, 1982. She got a copy on eBay. And Niels says it's a really good book as well. You know,
right.
That's one to think of. The Strategies series, very, very old series, but they had functions work. There was starting strategies, strategies, developing strategies, advanced strategies, and they had little sections with functions. But yeah, I mean, it's a matter of thinking up yourself, you know, sort of what are the different ways that we can, you know, apologize or request or express obligation or so on, and sort of trying to make your own lessons.
Yeah, and I think with following what Mari is saying, like I remember that we would also, like, when you have students, maybe we have less of them after the pandemic, but when you have all these international students coming to England, stay in England, they have to register at the police, they have to register at the GP, they have to do certain things in England to basically start their student life in England. And for those, sometimes like that's the function, how to go to the GP, register, what to do, what to say, what language they need. And you just need to think about, if you know your students, if you know their needs, all you need to do is to think about what are they doing, what's their need, and create that little lesson of function lesson, go to the police, register this and that, you know, and that will help. Students' needs probably would make it even better, you know, more practical for them.
I think Gabby was also saying, like, how many functions do you teach in a lesson? And going back to what we were saying about level of the learners, you know, if you've got very low level learners, then you're only going to teach 1 or 2 functions because you don't want to overload them with too much information. But as you teach, you add functions as you go along. By the time you get to higher levels, they've already met a lot of the functions. And so you kind of group them all together, not all of them, but you can group lots of them together and then get them to organize them into, you know, asking for opinions, giving opinions, agreeing with opinions, disagreeing with opinions, partially agreeing with opinions or whatever. So at higher levels, you could have, you know, quite a few functions, maybe, you know, 5 for asking for opinions, 5 for giving opinions, 3 for agreeing, 3 for disagreeing, or whatever. So you'd have a lot that they're organizing and grouping under the different uses. Whereas at lower levels, you might begin with can and can't for ability. I can swim, but I can't ride a bicycle, for example. And you'd only be working with those 2. There was another question from somebody about, you know, how can I be more confident with teaching functions? I think confidence comes with experience, of course, but it also comes with being thoroughly planned for your lesson and rehearsing your lesson so that when you stand up in front of the students, you know what your aims are and you know how you're going to achieve those aims. Yeah. So planning, yeah, for confidence, and not trying to do too much. Yeah. Do what you are ready to cope with. Yeah. So that when you stand up, you do what you do well and confidently.
Gabby is also asking, I think Neil has also a question, but I'm not quite sure where the actual question is. So maybe Hedy can help with that, or Neil can unmute himself later, ask the question. But Gabby also is asking how very often students want to know the grammar, or they don't want to, how to basically, because they will be intolerant basically. And I think, Gabby, the best way to do it, make them aware of, you know, the function lesson, I think is important to explain this to students. Guys, this is not a grammar lesson. This is a situation. We are going to practice this situation. And there will be a little bit of grammar, vocabulary, this and that in this lesson. Very often a reading, or even more often like listening before you get into the actual function. But I think making them aware of that is quite important, so they don't become impatient, or as you say, Gabby, they're not too worried about the grammar and all of that, and making it clear that this is as important as a grammar lesson or vocabulary or other lessons. So I hope I have answered your question there, but I think that's quite important.
I think Neil wanted to come in to talk a little bit about the mismatch in corpora, and reality. I don't know. Do you want to? Can we unmute?
I think
Neil and let him join us and have his say. Hi, Neil.
Mari. Hi, Yasmin. Thank you so much for a really practical and a very useful session. I was in a session looking at teaching functional language at the end of last year, and the point was made that there is often a mismatch between the functional exponents that we see on course books, or that we teach when, for example, looking at the Cambridge exams, and then the reality of the most frequent ones in spoken language. So we might teach, for example, oh, I agree with you up to a point, but I see where you're coming from. That's a good point, but, when in reality, no but and yes and are by far the most common functional exponents for agreement and disagreement. And it worries me that we're teaching a pedagogical version of English rather than, and particularly for people in English-speaking countries, America, Australia, ourselves here in the UK, we're maybe doing our students a disservice. And for students who will be using English as a contact language and working at some points with native speakers, might also lose out as a result. I don't think there's any corpus that looks at the frequency of these exponents in English lingua franca contexts, but have you any tips on how we might go about teaching real language rather than course book language? Because I think there's a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, actually, because I mean, if I think of some of the books that taught functions in the past, there was a huge mismatch between what people actually say and what the course books were advocating, which is why, in a sense, it's better if the teachers can sort of like select more usual, more frequent exponents to teach the students. But the point that Gabby made was, well, if you're a non-native teacher and maybe you don't have that level of exposure to language, how can you choose which ones are important to teach and which ones not? And that's very tricky. And I think it comes down to looking at frequency of the way things are expressed on TV, in chat programs, for example, or in soap operas where you've got your people using informal language in informal situations, maybe trying to be a bit of a detective and pick out those useful bits of language that you can teach, because you've got a ready-made context there and you've got authentic language being used, rather than trusting course books, which maybe you shouldn't trust too much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that.
Can I add a little bit to that? While I agree with both of you, and it's absolutely true, with lower level learners, I think there is no harm in introducing the context and exposing students to those functions, the language, even though that we are not using exactly the same phrases or sentences, introducing, making them aware of that, teaching the culture aspect of it, and so many other things, so that when they are, or they reach to a higher level, or they are in a like an English speaking environment, or the right context that they would use, then they would be able to choose, or better choose, or pick the more natural phrases or natural forms or functions. But if they don't have, they have to start from somewhere. And even so, and I totally agree with you that the books are very probably not as natural as much as they should be, but they have to start from somewhere. And hopefully when the level goes higher, hopefully they, as you and Mari said, from the context, from speaking to English speaking people, from soaps, TV, they will pick, hopefully they will pick on those, and they will choose them, you know, and use them.
I think that's true, because, you know, if something is used frequently, you hear it frequently.
Yeah.
And then you start to use it. But Nada was talking about, you know, well, what do we do in our context? Because context is so important, you know, and not everybody is going to be using their English in the British context. And so, you know, the language that you use is clearly going to be the language that is appropriate for the context that you're in the same way that the behavior that you show is appropriate for the context that you're in. I mean, I know, for example, the first time I put my hand out to shake hands with one of my students and he refused to shake hands with me, I got a big shock, you know. But then I learned that it was culturally inappropriate for him to shake hands with a woman. And after that, you know, I never assumed that someone was going to shake hands with me. And now with COVID, nobody wants to shake hands anyway, so we're fine, you know.
Yeah. yeah. But
and also they've done studies about your personal space as well. You know, how close do you come to someone? And you can see, you know, videos of, you know, people sort of backing off around a room because someone is coming in too close, they move away. The person moves in, they move away, you know, because in Britain we have this sort of like, you're quite a big space between two people when they're talking to each other. So all these sort of basic cultural, you know, the physical space that we inhabit and the types of interactions, physical interactions we have vary from culture to culture. And so with function, you know, I mean, it's considered more polite to be more formal in some cultures.
Yeah. No, great question, and that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any more questions?
I'm going to go back to the chat box and have a look.
That's a good question, Hedy. I mean, I'm sure videoing your students and looking at the language they use. I mean, if you think about, you know, task-based lessons, where you get the students to do a task, and then you can see where the gaps in the task are, and then maybe you could give them an example, you know, something like native speakers doing the task, and then analyze the language that's useful, and then give them another opportunity to do the task. So task-based learning lessons work really, really well when you're trying to sort of like fill in the gaps for how people use language authentically. So if you can get native speakers to do a task, that's very helpful. I know that there's a pair work task where one person has a room with furniture and objects, and the other person has the room and they have to put the objects into the correct place, or they have to put the furniture into the correct place. And teachers often teach, you know, there is a vase on the left-hand side of the mantelpiece, you know, there is a sofa in the middle of the room, and so on. But that's not really what native speakers would say if they were doing the task. So it might be nice to get real people to do the task, record it, and then you've got authentic language that you can then use in the classroom to help your students to produce authentic language rather than textbook language.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a question from Nada about, again, differences between the cultures, and specifically Middle Eastern students and West, probably West culture, and how, you know, how we can do this. Now that I teach at Qatar University, and I teach them English, and my students are Middle Eastern students, and very often, you're right, the cultural differences are very much, it's a lot. And I think very often you find yourself, again, raising students' awareness. It's when you're teaching language, it's about teaching language and culture. You can't separate these two. And you need to probably, as we said earlier in the session, sometimes you find yourself having chats with the students, like explaining the culture, explaining why it works, giving them examples so that they understand the culture before you start looking at the actual language, teaching them English. So yes, there might be times that you want to teach culture, giving them examples. Even if you're a non-native teacher, still you have to, I'm sure you have the awareness because you're a teacher, so you need to do that for them and make them aware of it, and then language teaching as normal. Well, it is quite important to raise awareness. You can't separate these two, culture and language. They are linked closely.
There's an interesting question from Gabby. She said, should we teach functional lessons as a sort of a lesson that's sort of like dedicated to teaching function rather than integrating it into the lessons? And I think the best way is integrating it into the lessons, to be perfectly honest, because you know, vocabulary, function, meaning, pronunciation, all of those are sort of like intermingled. And so, you know, and also as they come up, you know, you have an opportunity in the class to sort of suddenly pop something in and work on it, you know. But as Yaz said, you know, whether you're a native speaker or you're non-native speaker, yeah, you've both got, you know, a standard of English that means that you're actually able to teach English, yeah. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a non-native speaker or a native speaker. Be confident, you know, you're fantastic. You've reached that level of English where you can share your knowledge with other people. Yeah. So I don't think it's a problem at all. And if you are worried about pronunciation and intonation, you can always use sort of like live models from, you know, audio in your textbook, or from videos or so on that you're using with your learners, little snips of films or programs. I know Faulty Towers was always a popular one because you had lots of service interaction, or people booking into the hotel, or people asking for things, or waiting on tables and so on. So you had examples of, not authentic English, but, pretty authentic English and quite funny.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely, Mari. And you might have even native speaker colleagues. I'm not 100% native speaker. I was born in England. I'm half Turkish, half Iranian. And I have colleagues that are 100% native speakers. And I always check pronunciation. Things I'm not sure, ask from colleagues, different people. And that gives you the awareness. And then, Mari, there was another good question in the chat box that okay. When it's somebody, it's Sylvia asking about if we teach, when we're teaching literature, ESP courses, do we teach functional language? Certainly for ESP courses, Sylvia, I would say yes. So as we mentioned before, like courses like English for Law, English for Business, you have actually the whole course, or the whole, the whole syllabus is very much heavily contextualized, and there probably are many function lessons to those. I'm not sure which ESP courses specifically you're talking about, but yes,
I think she mentioned medical English, and I think functional language is so important in medical English, and also knowing the kind of more informal ways of referring to things as well. Because I know for British people, mentioning anything below the waist is considered a no-no, and so we've got all sorts of polite ways of saying it without saying it, so the doctor says, what seems to be the matter? Oh, well, I've got a little bit of a problem down below. Because you're not going to mention exactly what part of the body, because we don't do that. And there's a very nice link on the internet, something like, it's called Speak Up, or Doctors Speak Up, and there's lots of interviews with various people. There's one of an interview with a person who's got a problem with alcohol, for example, and there's a different kind of delicate, sensitive situations, and it's quite nice, authentic language. I don't know if I can find it now, actually. It's was it Speak Up?
So Neil has got a very good example. He's teaching at the moment clinical communication skills, and there's functions, for example, checking patients' understanding. It's just a very good example, Neil. Thank you. There are lots of them for ESP courses. If it's business, it would be negotiation. If it's English for Law, it would be moot court. How you speak to a judge, to other colleagues. I'm sure with most ESP courses you do have a lot of function lessons involved, for sure. Even so, more than general English.
Where was I wanted to post that in the chat if I can. There we are. Paste. Doctors Speak Up. It's quite a nice one. I like it. It's got lots of really useful vocabulary as well. Checking student patient understanding, very important as well. So functional language in a medical situation is very, very important.
So
as I say, sometimes the mistakes in misunderstanding are quite funny. I had one with one of my students when I first started teaching, and he said, what money did you use? And I thought, no, he wants to say, how much money did you spend? So I'm going into a whole sort of like thing to try and elicit how much. And he said, no, what money did you use? Pounds? Euros, drachmas.
Absolutely.
And it was his question was perfectly okay. It was me that was a problem. I didn't understand what he wanted to say.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So I think we've answered all of the questions. I think our time is finishing. Am I right, Hedy? We're actually 5:30. We're on time.
I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out to come along today. It's been lovely. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Mari.